Hi everyone. As Boyman introduced, my name is Will Shorkey. Coney Benson is obviously up here as well. And we have Saeed Husseini. As Boyman was saying earlier, we wanted to talk about Revolutionary Papers, which is this fantastic transnational project that is an initiative that is trying to document, unearth, amplify radical periodicals, pamphlets, ephemera, etc., from anti-colonial struggles, both past, primarily past, but also present, as a way of situating what we do as Africa as a country, and the print edition that we're going to be launching later as part of a long-standing political and intellectual tradition. I'm not going to be able to do justice to the Revolutionary Papers project because its breadth and scope and depth is truly impressive. So we as Africa as a country have been really proud and privileged to be able to partner with Revolutionary Papers. This morning, we collaborated with the Ukombozi Library to present a workshop at the NBO Litfest at Eastlands Library, and that was a really fantastic and rich event. And we're going to draw out some of what I heard in that event later when we talk about the print edition. And we've got Saeed here as our West Africa regional editor, one for eye candy, two, no, I'm kidding, sorry Saeed, I don't mean to throw you on the spot like that. Two, because he's also featured in the Revolutionary Papers project. So once Coney has walked us through what this project is all about, we're gonna have a conversation with Coney and Saeed about the publications that populate the universe of Revolutionary Papers. So Coney, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to Africa as a country. For us, Africa as a country sort of embodies the ongoing work of a lot of the archival, anti-colonial movement material work that we do at Revolutionary Papers Project. So Will was asking if I could speak a little bit about why we started the project and then what we've been doing. And I guess I'll first say that one of the things we've done is we have this exhibition which is up. So all of these banners first went up in 2022 in Cape Town. It was a curation by an artist, Pokeng Setai, and I'll show you some images of how it played out in Cape Town, and it's been traveling, so it's really a privilege to get to bring the exhibition here and to see it in different spaces. Revolutionary Papers Project is an international, transnational, transdisciplinary, anti-disciplinary project, working mostly with periodicals, that is newspapers, newsletters, magazines, circulars, things that were serialized and created in anti-colonial movements across the global south. I mean, in just one edition of any magazine, and these are examples of them, so you see Casas de las Americas or the PLFP Bulletin or whichever of these you see, in one issue you will find stories, poems, comics, conference proceedings, letters to the editors, illustrations, international news, and these journals really were vehicles. And so we look at them as vehicles for creating counter-political, counter-cultural, and counter-institutional spaces in the midst of anti-colonial struggles. And oftentimes, you know, when we go back to want to know about the history of these struggles, we end up reading books written by experts that take these archival materials as primary sources to be extracted from and often taken out of context. And we find that going back to these movement materials, especially movements that were left and more left than most of what became the liberation ruling parties after independence, hold those movements to account and widen our imagination of the futures that people were fighting for and that we think we have to continue to fight for. The project, it's myself and two other co-conspirators or co-collaborators, on the project. Mavish Ahmad, she was a political journalist in Pakistan, and she now teaches sociology at the London School of Economics, and her work is on Balochistan. And Hannah Morgenstern, who was a housing organizer and an LGBTQ organizer, and now teaches post-colonial literature at the University of Cambridge. And Hannah works on Arab and Jewish left literature post-Nakba. So from Palestinian literature. And so these kind of three different geographies, three different academic disciplines. I myself am trained as a historian from South Africa, working with movements to document organizing for what should be public services, housing, water, you name it. So ongoing liberation struggle histories. Where the old archives are really important, but creating new archives as we go and from within movements is also really important. So we take these movement publications seriously as spaces of thinking, spaces of art, the distribution, the stories of distribution are also stories of network building and alternative solidarities. So I don't know if you could see on the slides, but the first slide is or maybe we just dim the lights a little bit, then you could see. Okay, so this is a slide from the website. The website's revolutionarypapers.org, so everything that I'll say is already on there. But we've organized it where we now have about 150 people in our network who work on these magazines. And we always ask people not just what was in the magazine, but where did it circulate? When did it circulate? How did it circulate? And how is it relevant to today? And you'd think those are quite simple questions, but it kind of weeds out who's doing work for different kinds of reasons. And what is in the pages of magazines, often you have to ask beyond that to find the answers. Often these magazines don't even have the year of publication. It'll say number 1, March. It's like, was that 1962? Was it 1984? And so you can click on any of the magazines, but also you can cross-reference across the Global South, but across keywords, socialism, feminism, ecology, etc., or by decade or by region. So here's another example. And they're all up there. If anyone works on a magazine and wants to add it to the site, you can just be in touch with us. And I just wanted to mention this, one of the magazines that I research, Upbeat Magazine. I just wanted to mention it kind of in my introduction because it's relevant to Africa as a country. It was a magazine called Upbeat Magazine that circulated during the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa to over 100,000 youth. So it had a readership, a wide readership for about 15 years. And Sean Jacobs, who was one of the founders of Africa as a Country, grew up reading Upbeat Magazine. And he said to me in an interview, I was doing interviews with readers of Upbeat Magazine, and he said, well, what else did I read? There was the official apartheid curriculum, and then there was Upbeat Magazine. And Upbeat Magazine editors would get over 600 letters a week from readers, and they would publish those. They would set people up with pen pals, which were called pen friends. They would have letters written in. They had a history section, an African history section, and these were all things that were banned by the apartheid state. But what Sean told me that was also really interesting is that from reading Upbeat, he learned not just about the situation of others across a very segregated South Africa, but also how to organize democratically. So within the pages of Upbeat, there would be like how to set up a student representative council, how to hold a democratic meeting. And he said that that kind of culture of democracy within organizing, he didn't learn anywhere else. So in addition to learning the power of print media and alternative media, Upbeat was really important in his journey. Almost every single anti-colonial movement and movement now you will find has a magazine. I mean, now, this was obviously in the days before social media and electronic media, and so the stories of printing these things, cyclostyles, rhizomes, underground distribution is really interesting. And we speak to the artists, we speak to the distributors, because movements are collective work, and movement writing is collective work. And so what we find in the pages of these magazines is 1,000 experiments of collective work that was traveling, that was recruiting. Most young people, their first act of revolutionary participation would be to distribute or to read aloud or to write for these magazines. And so the writing was not separated from the fighting. And I know Walter Rodney is really famous for saying that you write while you fight and you fight while you write. And these days, these things are siloed so that we have, you know, you're the historian, you're the teacher, you're the artist. And that's not what was happening in the midst of these magazines. Many magazines that we find have the name Spark. Like Cheche magazine means spark, I think, in Kiswahili. Well, Lenin had a magazine called Iskra, which means spark. And I just want to read you quickly what he said. He said, "A newspaper is not only a collective propagandist and a collective agitator, it's also a collective organizer. A paper may be compared to the scaffolding erected around a building under construction. It marks the contours of the structure and facilitates communication between the builders, permitting them to distribute the work and to view the common results achieved by their organized labor." And so those are the kinds of things that we're interested in these magazines. And I think I'll stop there. There's many parts of the project, and I have some slides to show you, but I think I'll pause there, and then we can talk about it more.
Thank you so much, Connie. That was a fantastic overview about the project. And it's an incredible resource, extremely rich, extremely detailed, and I think that you and your team have put together something kind of really fantastic. I'm curious to know sort of what was the thing which sparked your interest collectively in embarking on this project? And could you kind of walk us through how it all began, how it found the expression that it currently did, how you were able to sort of build this network of other people doing similar work around you, just a sense of the history of how this all developed.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, Mavish and Hannah and I, we started talking, we were all frustrated by the same thing. And we were frustrated by post-colonial print culture, where people were just pulling out, you know, now you have Che on a t-shirt, or now you have a really cool print from Ospal in a frame on a wall, with this disconnect between these works that, yes, they're beautiful, but they were actually trying to challenge capitalism, colonialism, racism. And so we were frustrated with the way that they were disconnected from ongoing struggles, but they were also disconnected from the movement work. So oftentimes people would extract like the thinking of, I don't know, Fanon or Césaire, and people who we all appreciate reading, but these people were made through movements. And so we were interested in getting together and reading these magazines and taking them seriously. Not, these are the primary sources that we go into an archive and we extract from, and then, you know, off people go to write the real analysis. We were thinking these were curated archives in and of themselves that deserved, we wanted to read them for what is in them, but also to understand how they were made and how they facilitated communication across the global south. Like, what did third world solidarity mean? Yes, there's the Bandung Conference. Yes, there's these important moments, but how was it that these things were built from the ground up? And within the pages, there's so much debate and critique. They're not romantic. I mean, you could say, is it romantic, is it not? This is the grunt work of organizing. And we felt that often this was just sidestep, the more complicated work of finding and caring for these materials, and for the work it takes to put them into conversation with what's going on now. And so we wanted to come together and look at this, and we put out a call for a small workshop thinking like there's maybe 10 archive radical history nerds out there who want to come. And we got over 80 applications from across the entire global south. And we realized there's actually a lot of interest. And then we were planning this workshop that became a conference, and then COVID happened. And so we spent the next 2 years doing online study sessions, sometimes geographically, like dissident histories of Pakistan. And we would connect with old archivists, activists who had been in these movements for 30, 40 years, the veterans and the OGs who had these materials and who wanted to speak about them and share them. And so we started to connect that way. And eventually, when we had the conference, it blew up into this huge conference when we thought it would be a small workshop. And that's when we got the exhibition made. And out of the conference, we then wrote a proposal to Radical History Review to do a special edition. And again, we ended up getting 100 submissions. And in the journal, we wanted it to be global. So that means you could have maybe 1 or 2 articles from each continent. And the second half of what we do is it's our experiment of how do we make sure that these materials are not then set in a new kind of colonial enclosed archive. And so we created these digital teaching tools with 3 different methods of how you can do them. The digital teaching tools have different formats. So you can take Lotus, the Afro-Asia literary magazine, and have it as if it's spread out on a tabletop and click on different ones. But the person working on Lotus would then explain the context and the relevance and whatnot. And so for Radical History Review, we said to them, the kind of politics of this pedagogy is as important to us. So half of the journal will be for that. So because we got all of these great applications, we approached Africa as a country to say, don't you want to do a series with us of papers from the African left? Because we've got so much great material. And so we spent about 1.5 years doing a 13-part series. Saeed has an excellent piece up there, which I'll leave to him to speak about. But yeah, these were our frustrations, and then we were challenging ourselves to try to kind of think of answers. And the final thing is that we really want to have almost launches that are events that bring the politics, the art, and the archivists together. And so in all of our events, they're run as kind of workshops where we can launch and dive into these archives for ongoing activism. And so we end up having musicians doing, struggle music from South Asia and South Africa. For example, at the conference, we had fallists from South Africa when we did the Cape Town event, a lot of the older veterans, a lot of contemporary artists and organizers, and then a lot of publishers, so all the kind of left independent publishers. And we just try to bring people in so that you get a sense of the breadth of the past work, but the ongoing ways of making sure that this doesn't become a kind of trendy topic for new PhD theses, which we don't discourage at all. But we want to link the scholarship and the research with the teaching and the political education work. I don't know if we always get it right, but that's what we've been experimenting with in different ways.
Thank you, Connie. I want to ask a question about what you flagged just now about wanting to avoid this becoming new trendy kind of topic. But speaking of trendiness, to turn to you, Saeed. In a moment you'll hear it. But when people think of Nigerian history, Nigeria kind of, as far as I can tell, we were kind of talking about this the other day, doesn't feature as prominently in sort of radical histories of anti-colonial nationalism, or there is no sort of, let's say, singular figure that sits in the pantheon of, godfathers and godmothers of anti-colonial radicalism in the way that it is the case for a lot of other countries. And I think a lot of people, including myself, genuinely until I read your piece on Africa as a country, didn't really know much about the radical left tradition in Nigeria. And you speak about one magazine, The Analyst, which was based in north central Nigeria in Jos, and which involves figures who populated this tradition. So could you maybe talk a little bit about not only just The Analyst as a magazine, but also about sort of what they represented?
Yeah, for sure. I think the context you've set about where Nigeria fits or doesn't in the kind of history of revolution in Africa is important because it's kind of the context they were operating in. And I mean, you've been generous in saying, Nigeria is kind of not necessarily part of that conversation, but I think one could go further and say, in fact, that in a sense, Nigeria was a center of a kind of counter-revolution. You can think of the fact that our first post-independence president, Tafawa Balewa, who does loom large in a certain circle, was one of the key opponents to Nkrumah's policy or proposal for unification, continental unification. So nonetheless, you're right that there was, in the opposition movements, in the unions, among students, among intellectuals in the campuses, a oppositional tradition of radical left activism, of radical left thinking, and the analyst emerges from within that kind of culture. So the analyst, I hope we can maybe see a picture of it before the end, but it was a magazine published by a collective of scholar activists based in the universities of Zaria and the universities of Jos. And in fact, the University of Zaria ends up being one of the kind of key nodes in the continental kind of network of universities that became homes for radical intellectuals and activists. So some of the people who were part of the analyst included folks like Yusuf Bala Usman, Balarabe Musa, who ended up becoming the governor of Kaduna State briefly in the 70s in Nigeria, and a host of others. And their ambitions were quite lofty, but also fairly plural. On the one hand, they wanted to reach a different audience than that had not exactly been reached by kind of radical intellectuals in Nigeria at the time. And I think that really defined the format they chose, because as oppositional thinkers and activists, the kind of formats that dominated in the time period, and we're talking about the late 70s and early 80s, were either, on one hand, kind of these more theoretical Marxist journals, or on the other hand, sort of pamphlets and slightly more, let's say, disposable or like kind of less tangible, less permanent forms of publishing. And they wanted to do something a bit in the middle with a magazine. And so, the audience also for the magazine was quite interesting because with a magazine, they wanted to reach a much wider kind of literate audience, a much more artistically inclined audience, and also an audience that might not have been exposed to left ideas or belong to left organizations. And to do this, in terms of their circulation, they often tried to partner with or kind of build upon the circulation networks of some newspapers that were commonly read by kind of progressive, educated, kind of salaried, you could say elite, or I think the contemporary term might be professional, managerial kinds of elite. Why did they do that? I think to think about that, it's also important to think a little more about the time period in which they were operating. So the Analyst was published first in July of 1986. It was the same year when the structural adjustment programs were introduced to Nigeria. In fact, it was the year when the sort of official announcement of the SAP budget was introduced by the Babangida regime at the time. Of course, there had been austerity programs, as elsewhere, that were implemented in the late 70s, but structural adjustment proper began that year. And it seemed, reading the Analyst and talking to some of the people who worked around it, that they observed that the adjustment policies had opened up the possibility of building a much wider collective or coalition of people who were ill done by the policies, people who were suppressed and whose economic fortunes had declined so dramatically, including people who were in the professional managerial class at the time. Because as you know, of course, the adjustment programs came with retrenchments, targeted a lot of intellectuals in the academy as well as unionists. So the idea behind the magazine format then was to kind of build a new kind of coalition around opposition to the adjustment programs, and then maybe through that expand the demographic that came into contact with left ideas. So some of the paradoxes that that confronted are obvious. Trying to build a left in a sense within maybe not the traditional class of leftist thinking. An additional one, of course, is the question of funding. How do you sustain a magazine at a moment when the economic situation is becoming more dire and people's spare income was becoming harder to come by? And because of this, they decided to pursue a quite unique strategy of approaching small-scale local manufacturers who were also, of course, at risk of going out of business with the liberalization and increased imports. And that, for a time, proved successful. So when the pictures come up, or if you're able to look at the website, the article we published, some of the advertisements in the article include local beer companies, small mechanic shops, and a host of other kinds of indigenous, and small to medium scale businesses. This eventually, as you can imagine, proved to be difficult because this was a vanishing sector as the adjustment policies dug in. And so one difficulty they faced is, of course, sustaining the magazine in the face of these pressures. And also the fact that they were confronting capitalist interests in the pages of the magazine. In fact, the first edition of the magazine, which is the one I discuss a bit in the article, proposed to unmask the masters of Nigerian capitalism. And so did these profiles of the kind of biggest shareholders of some of the main companies that dominated the economy. And that came with blowback. I mean, they faced immediately a libel case, spent a lot of money and their time chasing down the legal process. And these pressures, I think, constricted the amount of time they had for organizing and, of course, the capacity they had to continue to produce the magazine. And so by the end of the decade, by the early 90s, they had hit a rock and actually couldn't continue with publishing The Analyst as it stood. One quick thing I'll add also is that, I know I've gone for a while, is that they also attempted to publish in a local language. They attempted a version of The Analyst in Hausa and named it, somewhat in that tradition of Iskra. They named it Lantern. Fitila is the term in Hausa, which of course requires a spark to light. And Fitila also had a circulation, but similarly faced the same problem. So, encountering The Analyst has, I think, been one way to sort of expand my own vision and the vision of a few of us who have this interest in radical print culture in Nigeria, in respect to the kinds of networks, the kinds of groups, and the kinds of dynamics that influenced the sort of history of the left in that period of time. And to conclude, I also note that this has emerged as part of a wider project that we've been part of to digitize the archives of Nigerian left radicals in Nigeria, in various parts of Nigeria, including in Zaria, where this magazine is based and where the institution left by Yusuf Bala Usman, one of the editors of this magazine, has been founded. But there are a host of other institutions and also private archives that have become part of this project. And in addition to magazines such as The Analyst, we've encountered a host of very interesting material, including letters from across the African continent, correspondences between Nigerian radicals and, for instance, Southern African liberation activists who were in exile. The ANC features quite largely, the PAC included, SWAPO, and then a lot of material from Ghana as well. So it turned out that even though Nigerian leftists were in the margins in their own society, they were playing quite a prominent role in radical governments across the country, including in the Nkrumah government and later on in the Rawlings regime. So I think I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Said. That was very insightful, and yeah, no one minds at all when you speak. I want to ask a question to both of you, based off of what you've shared with us now, and kind of, at the risk of romanticizing that period, which I am admittedly very prone to do, but encountering these archives, encountering these journals, encountering your experiences of them and others' experiences of them, there's something about that time period which seems to me as if kind of ideas and the exchange of ideas had mobility to them, that there was a real kind of energy behind the issues that people in these positions were grappling with, that there were transnational solidarities that were being forged much more kind of robustly than one could arguably say now. And this is kind of all in spite of a climate often of marginalization or repression or kind of economic deprivation. Is that an accurate characterization is I guess the first question. I imagine probably not. It's a little bit more complicated. And if not, then sort of what, is there anything to glean from that time period as far as the work of trying to advance radical scholarship that is popular and accessible and that arises in tandem with movement building, as you were saying earlier, Coney, not just sort of ideas floating, but ideas that are embedded in actual struggle. What is this? What can we learn from the way this was approached back then? I mean, someone at the workshop today was saying that each kind of generation has an upsurge in activism and activity, and then sometimes can forget their predecessors, right? And part of this project shows who our predecessors are, at least in terms of how they produced and debated and circulated radical ideas.
I mean, that's 20 great questions. I do think, on the one hand, you can read these journals and feel inspired, and I don't know if that's the spark of all romance, but you see people, yes, you see people coming together to do something. It's a serious collective. But with Revolutionary Papers, we decided that the project doesn't end when there's like independence, and the gap between the past and the present and the future is really quite a spiral in some ways. And so what's really interesting is we do have things that have been written now, like for example, Pathways to Free Education was a publication that came out of the Rhodes Must Fall movement in South Africa, and it was written as robustly. If you read what was written in the moment and the attempts to make alliances between students and workers, to take issues of sexism seriously, to think back to what would Black consciousness mean in this supposed rainbow nation, all of those questions. So if you read the current journals written from within movements, which is different to reading journals written by NGOs supporting movements, which is not to say those are not important. I actually think a lot of them are. But, writing a newspaper or a newsletter as a movement in the midst of struggle is different. And there's this amazing website called 858. It's about the Egyptian uprising from 2011 in Tahrir Square. And it was in 2016 that activists who had been involved came together and put together all of their material of video footage and writing from within the front lines. And they've also written about how difficult it was to then archive and to frame, given that they came together in a moment of demobilization. And they came together, in I think around 2016, and they've got some very harsh, honest critiques about not romanticizing those archives, but also knowing the importance of telling stories from the front lines. And I think for all of us now, we turn to those things for different reasons. And I think that if there is any reason that's related to ongoing struggle, the answer you'll get will be different in what you're looking for. Like, I was printing something the other day on scrap paper, and I just like flipped it over, and there's this poem about privatization. And I wished I knew what pile of scrap paper this was from, because it must have been from some journal from the 90s in South Africa that I just had used in some workshop or I don't know what. But the poem about privatization, I was thinking, if you read it now, it was kind of funny. But it was the first experiences of watching and trying to understand what is privatization and what happens when our commodities and our public services are commoditized, and how do you find a new language to politicize and explain what that is. And the vocabulary changes. Like, there's certain journals where they talk about transformation, and it was a radical idea. I mean, the idea of gender was radical at some point, and then it gets appropriated. And so I think it depends how you read these things and what you're reading them for. And then the other thing is, like, one of my favorite historians is Robin Kelly, and he always talks about how hindsight is not 20/20. In fact, it's like tunnel vision, because if you're standing in the past, let's say it's 1930, and you're in Cuba, and you're reading a journal that's on our site called Medio Dia, and it's trying to convince people that fascism is a kind of internationalist project. And the author of that piece, Tony Wood, is arguing that the impacts of trying to build a popular front against fascism only show up 20 years later. So in that 1930s moment, there was nothing victorious about what these organizers were doing, but it starts to change the way that people see things. And then the language changes. Again, so then popular front is not such a great term, or even decolonization in South Africa now, it's like has been appropriated by all the universities that are neoliberalizing faster than you can blink. And so I think it depends. And the last thing I'll say, though, is often these days you hear, like, who controls the narrative, and people were being called out from so long ago. Like, I came across a PAC journal where they were in exile and doing a book review. There was like a column within one of their 4 magazines. Every quarter, the column came out, and it took about a year for it to go through page by page this new history book about the PAC that had come out, written by Tom Lodge, a white South African historian. And the PAC was like, he's got this wrong, because he's saying that we're in conflict with the ANC, and actually, here's where we ally, here's where we don't. And so I think if you take the time to really read the details, it's so complicated that it can't be romantic, but it can be really inspiring.
Thanks, Connie. That's, really beautiful way of putting it. Saeed?
I mean, we certainly can't copy-paste from the past, right? Because the conditions are so dramatically different. But I think I would say there are 2 things that I would emphasize that we can kind of connect to these past movements and connect past movements to contemporary struggles. One is the fact that in most cases, we're not talking here about ancient history. We're talking about, like, half a lifetime ago, or maybe 1 full lifetime. So it means that in some cases, some of the, not even foundation stones, some of the pillars that are holding up the contemporary moment, you can understand actually where they come from. Some people who might want to call themselves hustlers, you can understand that they might have been beneficiaries of the privatization program, for instance, and that might have given them a start. So these kinds of pieces of history that are still relevant to the present day, to our kind of struggle at the moment, are littered in the pages of some of these journals, the kind of pamphlets, and the variety of kind of forms that you encounter in these archives. I think a second thing to highlight is we also live in a moment when amnesia is weaponized, right? Where people feel like their struggle is kind of novel, and they're so uncertain about what's possible, uncertain about where they've come from, and kind of feeling like they need to reinvent the wheel. And again, I mean, there is some invention that needs to happen. But I think going through these papers and the archives and as a result of the project I've been part of has helped me understand that some organizational forms, some tactics can travel, and I'll give one example that we sort of discussed earlier. So one of the things we did recently was to host an exhibition of some of the materials that were a little more visually appealing: posters, pamphlets, some letters, and just some kind of some printed material, reprinted material that we thought would be kind of enticing to a new generation. So we, in Abuja, Nigeria, kind of reprinted some of the material, and as part of an ongoing kind of conference that a separate group had hosted, displayed these materials on the wall. And people were going around like looking at the feminist calendar from 1986, looking at letter exchanges between Thabo Mbeki and Yusuf Bala Osman, and then looking at meeting minutes, looking at a call for a meeting of Nigerian Tenants Association. And one group of young people were like, whoa, tenants can organize together, And they were like, hang on, we can't afford rent. Maybe a tenant association is something worth considering. And that sparked a conversation that has continued. And the idea of a tenant association might be quite well known in some context. But for a context where these sorts of organizations did play a role in the past, but then faded out, through various occurrences, it turns out that just seeing these materials can have some meaning. So again, of course, these things don't always translate one-to-one, but there are times when they might. And so I think that possibility and the fact that the openings that could result from these kinds of experiments make them worthwhile, I would say.
Thank you, Said. I want to give Coney a chance to walk us through some of the material as promised earlier. But before that, I want to invite it to everyone here. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts that you want to share, this will be an opportunity to do so. Yes. I don't know how to pass this to you.
Just to say thank you so much for creating this space and creating the space for historical consciousness. I think it couldn't have been done in a bit of time or space, given everything that's happening here in Kenya, in Nairobi. I'm really interested when we think about that long durée of these various movements. So, for example, Said, you talk about Nigeria as a spite not just of sort of a weak left movement, but particularly, thinking about a kind of counter-revolutionary site. And I often, I love to say South Africa is the best and worst place in the world. And not because it's inherent in terms of its radical traditions. It's not because South Africans are inherently more radical than anybody else, but it has to do with particular material conditions that create a kind of revolutionary consciousness. It's not just because people woke up, it's because of a particular condition that is there. So I'm interested in the work that you're doing when you're going across thinking transnationally about what are the material conditions that allow for a particular kind of revolutionary consciousness, a revolutionary or transnational consciousness. So for example, myself, as a historian, I work on the 19th century, and I'm very interested in the fact that the kind of transnational imagination that was there at a time where it might have taken 3 weeks or a month or whatever it takes to get across, physically from one place to another, or a letter, I would say is far more expansive than now, when it just takes a tweet to get to my friend in Nigeria or to my friend in Cuba. So I'm interested in what you're seeing in terms of what are the material conditions that allow for a kind of consciousness that is different in this particular moment. If we're understanding that it's not about an inherentness about a particular generation or inherentness about a particular place, what are the conditions that you're seeing as you're moving across particular archives that then allow for a godfather or a godmother or a movement to emerge? What is that is particularly emerging as you're working across various traditions.
Thank you, Panache. And if you're comfortable, you can also introduce who you are if you want to.
Oh, hi. Hi, my name is Panache Chikumadzi. I'm a historian, I'm a writer, and yeah, happy to be here. And I'm a contributor to Africa as a Country, so yeah.
Thank you, Panache. Excellent contributor to Africa as a Country. Does anyone else have any questions? We'll maybe take a few and then give Said and Kony an opportunity to engage with them. Yeah. Is there a way? Yeah, you can project, yeah.
I'm just wondering, have there been any efforts to maybe revive some of these older publications, like an upbeat or e-analysis or something like that, just to sort of tap into the, the ethos of these publications?
Thank you, Maher. And who are you? No, get it. We got it. No, get it. Get it. Yeah. Thanks, Maher. Any other questions? Yes, the back. You can come, yeah, you can come to the front, yeah, feel free.
Hey guys, I'm Isaac, and I have a question. So, us as a country, we are at a stage whereby, talking from what we are at a stage of revolution, yeah? And seeing what we are going through right now, and also going through back what has happened before, especially in this country in the 90s, yeah? I always wonder, like, how can we use the tools that we have to actually form a revolution that happens more inside than outside first? Because I feel like, how do I put it? There's a quote that says that the revolution will not be televised, you see. And I feel like it meant like the real revolution first happens inside, whereby nobody can see it, you know. And that now transcends to a powerful revolution that can be manifested physically, yeah? So I always wonder, how can we use the tools that we have, especially the people who are interested in the, can we call it the background or the strategy part of it, you know, yeah? To be able to make sure that the people who are on the streets or who are marching, taking action in any way, form, or how, can be able to be empowered and enriched inside. Because I feel that can kind of save time, be more impactful, and also unify us into one voice, yeah? So that's it, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Excellent question. We'll take one more and then we'll give Kony and Said a chance to engage. Maybe you should come up front, yeah.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angel. I'm a creative director living here in Nairobi since 2023. I think my point, you were mentioning about romanticizing the past or the past events that created revolutions. I think it's just normal, because I don't think revolution happens without community building. Because the whole point of you trying to change things because you care about the other is next to you, whether it's your mother, whether it's your partner, whether it's your children, you want a better future for them. So revolution is born, I think, is brewed in this sense of community and looking for improvement for the others around you. There is no revolution just for a self-interest. That's not revolution. That will, you can call it dictatorship, oppression, blah, blah. So I think it's good to feel that feeling of romanticizing it, or that we feel when look back at these events. It's okay because it's coming out of love for something better, and it's great as a trigger of actions. But then something else has to follow after. And I think sometimes this is where we get lost, because we're so hurt. But we're witnessing, and right now in this country, and not only in Kenya, in many parts of the world, there is a lot of people aching. And and then what do you want when you're feeling hurt? You want a hug. You want to feel loved. and then we revolve around this. But I think, yeah, we need to do that, but at the same time, we need to then, okay, fine, halas, let's do something about this. And then this is when we start to look into what are the actions we're going to take, what are you going to do? You're going to look into the past, what succeeded before, and at the end, what this guy was telling just before me, it's at the end, some things, I mean, nothing happens in a vacuum. We need to know the context. What just happened last week in Iran, between Iran, Israel, and the US, this is not new. This has a long history from 1953 when the CIA and the British deposed Mossadegh, a democratic elected leader in Iran, because they wanted the oil. So when you hear these comments about, like, yeah, but Iran is the devil, who says that? You know what I mean? So we need to connect the dots, but we need sometimes to follow back where the dots are coming from in order to be able to connect them properly, I think.
Thank you very much. Well said, thank you. And I want to give some really rich questions and comments from the audience for you guys. I want to give you a chance to engage with them. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for that. Really interesting questions. And I mean, this question about the material conditions, I really appreciate that, and something we could talk about all day, in a way. And I feel that, and curious to hear what you think, Connie, about this too. But I feel that part of the compromise that brought about independence, right, was a lot of African elites kind of promising to deliver something quite different from where people were coming from, right, to justify this new situation of independence. And so I think this kind of sets the context for the sorts of resources that people had in the 60s and 70s. University positions in places where, in a lot of cases, the electricity worked. The institutions kind of provided some basic facilities. The capacity to organize to some extent in labor unions and press your interests forward, the capacity to organize as students, the postal services, public libraries of the sorts that we're now struggling to revive today. So within those conditions, which, certain kinds of ideological projects were much more possible. And I think this is even true in Nigeria, where, as I've mentioned, the version of decolonization, experience of decolonization we had, was one that did end up being dominated by elite, even the sort of upper echelons of the aristocracy, that inherited power from the British. Despite, their own class positions, the fact that they were comfortable, even in the previous settlement and could be in the post-independence one, they still felt that pressure of having to deliver something for the independence that we got. So, of course, I think that in trying to understand the present and why some of our movements are not as effective, or some of our efforts are met with different level of resistance, we have to factor in the shattering of that old compromise, and the emergence of something much more brutal in a way, in the process that has resulted since then, where, structural adjustment, for instance, this kind of new democratization process, which, left the economic question off the table, has made people more likely to seek individualist solutions, more likely to not really find succor in the collective. I would say that, that kind of context feels crucial to me in trying to make sense of what has changed, but also in trying to make sense of what is possible. I think it's important to factor in those different realities and then to see what can nonetheless translate to our contemporary time. And then I'll just say in response to Mara, there have been attempts. I mean, drawing from, this previous question, to revive not only the Analyst, but some of the other, left-leaning pamphlets. So the Analyst, like I mentioned, had a new life briefly in a Hausa language version, Fitila. But some of the crowd that was around the Analyst got absorbed into a political project to sort of seek state power at the subnational level. And in fact, for a moment, they took the governorship of Kaduna and Kano states. So this is actually one of the reasons why the Analyst also petered out over time, is that people were engaged in actually the real kind of political questions for a while and had to kind of grapple with how to implement their ideas. They were pushed out of politics eventually, a longer process. The folks who survive today, some of them have gathered around actually an online project called Intervention. And they still put out quite interesting material. Of course, different kind of circulation, different kind of moment. But it's just to suggest that, yeah, despite all the changes that have occurred since then, some of that experience of the past still remains relevant. So Intervention would be one example of a website in Nigeria, intervention.ng, I think it is, that has inherited that kind of legacy of radical printmaking. Maybe I'll leave the other couple of questions.
Sure. I think this question also of understanding the different contexts, we've been thinking for years about, or I'd say daydreaming, about something we call Teaching 1948. And the idea of it is, how do you even start to understand what's going on in Iran today? How do you understand, so if we were to kind of create these primers on, you could take apartheid, you could take Nakba, you could take partition. Like, how would you translate across such huge contexts as an important part of being able to forge solidarity? And on the one hand, that would be really important, and we hope to do it. On the other hand, sometimes these things sit on a shelf until the moment you really need them. And in that moment, people will find out how to know what is going on in Palestine, or how to understand what is going on. And so I'm quite fascinated by the relationship between kind of mobilization and then demobilization, because we have these moments where things happen, and then we have these long rollbacks, and now we're sitting with the undiscussed repercussions, and it makes organizing really difficult. And I sometimes think that history writing is really important as far as kind of healing, in that writing and self-writing and reflecting on where we've come from, and putting personal kind of pains and journeys into bigger political context are really useful for thinking about collectives and collective mobilization. But then when you try to think about it across borders and what is it that people can do, often the first thing we do is we start to try to read about what's going on in, let's say, Palestine, and we want to hear from the voices of the people in Palestine, and where are those materials, and where is that self-writing? And I think sometimes for us, one of the best things we can do is almost create counter publics. Like, we could take these old materials, and we do take them, but to just circulate them again and republish them out of context doesn't often get us anywhere. So for example, there's this archiving project I'm part of called the SACED Archiving Project. And SACED was the biggest anti-apartheid education organization in the 1980s and 1990s. And they've been digitalizing all of their old stuff. But now what they've decided to do is, instead of just trying to reprint and circulate these materials, to create what they're calling Paulo Freire Labs, where they're taking an organization now that's interested, for example, in African history or community worker coalitions or art or progressive science or youth, whatever the issue is, and trying to find creative ways to feed the old materials back to have conversations about what's going on now. And that's slow, because then it means you need real people in real time, but it's those conversations that I think are going to come up with what's most relevant from the past materials till now. So, for example, the last place we had this exhibition up was at a place called Pelican House in London, which is like a building full of community or like left organizations. And so we had this event, and we had, for example, there's a teaching tool that was made by Thayer Hastings, and it's on the bayanats from the first Intifada. So the circulars that would be dropped and circulated everywhere. And we had people from the London-based Palestine youth movement. And this was just a month or so ago. So it's in the context of organizing in the last, year and a half of ongoing genocide. And we got the audience to read on the slides the actual text of the first bayan that came out. And it was saying, like, on this day, the bakers must do this, the teachers must do this, the mothers must do this, the youth. And then it created the conditions for a conversation about the debates happening right now in a place like London about direct action, protest, divestment, like what strategies are people trying and what is working and not working in the contemporary context. And so it wasn't exactly like we must do what they did in, occupied territories 20 years ago, but it created that kind of cross-place and cross-generational discussion around solidarity. And oftentimes the older people who had been involved, and you're right, they're alive. I mean, at least in South Africa, they're definitely alive. They're getting older and older as we speak. But they could say, like in London, again, we had Selma James talking about editing the correspondence, which she worked on as part of the Johnson Forest Tendency with CLR James and Grace Lee Boggs and that crew. And so she was talking about learning how to first edit a magazine, having finished high school education and not thinking of herself as a writer, and what it meant to then start editing, and how, in her opinion, and in conversation with very particular Caribbean feminists, they've been speaking about what happens when you almost neglect the sectoral work to come together for a unified struggle. And then how do you do both? And so it was a kind of learning from past experiences, but also thinking through current strategies. And I think that's the way to kind of cross the boundaries. And so even though our magazines can travel, and luckily they can travel, you can think of all the things you've read that you would have never heard if it hadn't been in words written from, long time ago or far away. But then to come together and read and discuss and figure out what we're going to do now is a lesson I take from these journals being part of movement building.
Thank you so much, Connie and Saeed. So we have unfortunately run out of time for this panel. It's a pity. It would have been nice to have a look at the teaching tool that Connie is describing. But if you want to find out more, if you want to check out the publications and periodicals that are covered, check out the teaching tools, head over to revolutionarypapers.org. It's an incredible resource, and I think it's just, the work that you have done alongside collaborators like Saeed, I think is truly inspiring and phenomenal. And I want to thank you guys once again for speaking to us today, and to thank you all for your great questions. We are going to move ahead and take a very short break, after which we will come back and launch the Africa is a Country print edition. And it is in this print edition where we try to grapple, as you were flagging, Connie, with the central question of mobilization and demobilization. So if you want to grab a copy of that during the break, please head over to the back where our fantastic editorial assistant, Mariana, will be. There are 2 versions of the newspaper available. One is free, which is great, and we want you to take that. But if you are so inclined, there is a premium version which you can pay for, which will help Africa as a Country subsidize its work. We're not quite at the stage where we have to use sort of beer companies yet to raise revenue, and we're hoping to stay as far away from that as possible. But if there are any Tusker representatives in there, no, I'm kidding. So do grab an issue of the print edition, get some food, grab a drink, go to the bathroom. And at 6:30, we'll launch the newspaper and continue the kinds of conversations we're having here that began earlier this day and truly that have been raging throughout this week. And so we look forward to that. And thank you guys once again.